Dr. Adam Crabtree, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Well, I'm really happy to have you on the show and looking forward to discussing your latest book with you. I see you have a long history as a psychotherapist.
Oh, yes.
Is there a certain theoretical school of psychotherapy that you just subscribe to?
Well, I was trained in psychoanalysis to begin with.
Okay.
Went somewhat in the direction of Wilhelm Reich and others, and Jung. It's become quite eclectic for me, particularly since I've gotten into working with hypnosis, dissociative states, and that sort of thing. My theoretical background has deepened and spread far beyond psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I get that impression too from your book. We have a lot in common. I have a long-standing interest in hypnosis. My doctoral dissertation was in part about hypnosis, and I also have had a long-standing interest in Carl Jung and his work and approach. And
Okay.
and in the book, I noticed other touch points. But so you have in fact written a number of books over the years.
Yes.
And your most recent one, which I believe is 2017, just come out. It's titled Evolutionary Love and the Ravages of Greed.
Yes.
And somehow those two words juxtaposed to one another struck me as strange bedfellows.
Yes.
Surprising juxtaposition. Maybe you can give us we're going to talk about the book in more detail, but maybe you can give us the 40,000 foot gist of the title.
Okay. Evolutionary love is it's a phrase that I got from Carl Sanders Peirce, who is an American philosopher, a great American philosopher. He wrote a little treatise called Evolutionary Love. And it's really a treatise about evolution in a cosmic sense of the word, that it's not just about biological evolution, as Darwin of his day was working at, but it went far beyond that to evolution of the whole cosmos. And he saw that the philosophers over the ages have always pointed to love as having a very special and important foundational place in the universe, in producing and maintaining the universe. And he moves in that direction, seeing love, as he understands it, or what he calls agape, being a enabling condition for the universe to come about and for evolution to take place. And so evolutionary love is that powerful force of the universe that is experienced in that broadest context, but it's also, we experience evolutionary love as individuals, as free human beings. And we're unique in that, and that we, in a way, partake in being able to experience evolutionary love, not just receive it, but actually to give it consciously. And the greed part of it, I see greed as a defect in the practice of loving, in that, as I will probably get a chance to say, there are two foundational kinds of love: agape, that I just mentioned, of Peirce, and eros, the older Greek approach to love. And agape is love that's unconditional, it's without strings, and it's benevolent. It's for the sake of the loved one. Whereas eros is a desire love, which is for the sake of the lover, who wants to get close to the loved one, who wants to partake in the value of that loved one and be enriched by that loved one. And the approach that I take is that both of those loves are crucial for evolution and must be in a balance if evolution is going to go forward. And if we are to act morally, for us, agape must always have a place of primacy over eros, because eros can take over and become, unfortunately, devouring, where we want to be enriched beyond what is good for the loved one.
Yeah, you were going to say something about greed, but we can put that off and work our way through a little bit more to go into greed. So, you know, when I first picked up the book, I didn't realize how philosophical it was going to be. It's really sort of philosophical, theological in some ways, more than it is about how to do therapy, although you've got some therapeutic examples in it.
Yes, it is not anything like a manual or an approach to therapy specifically, but I find that using this framework makes psychotherapy a lot more, for me, it makes a lot more sense, the process of what psychotherapy actually is and what the client is trying to accomplish in their life, which is really to actualize their potentials.
Well, maybe as we go along, if there are any case examples that come to mind, maybe you could throw those in. That always helps to enliven things. And also, do you have a phone you need to turn off? Or?
Turned off. Yep. Sorry.
Okay, great. Um, and also to bring it down to practicality,
Yes.
instead of all being up in the realms of abstraction.
Yeah.
So who's your intended audience for the book, by the way?
Well, you know what? It's anyone who has a desire to look deeper, not only into what happens in human life and in our inner world, the world of the unconscious or the subconscious, but also deeper in terms of the meaning of life and into what's happening in the human community. And that's where the greed part will come in. I think that there are people in many different fields and many different backgrounds who have that desire to understand about those things and to develop a deeper framework for seeing the world and where the direction of the world is going right now.
So really, the potential audience should be more or less everyone.
It should be, yes, and it's true. It has a kind of philosophical bent, so it might not be for everyone. But I think it doesn't have the kind of philosophy that's abstruse or technical.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that you got the concept of evolutionary love from the philosopher Charles Peirce.
Yes.
It's pronounced Peirce, isn't it, rather than Pierce?
Peirce rather than Pierce, yeah.
Yeah, I think I remember that from my undergraduate days, actually. And he died in 1914. So, and of course, psychology has a history going back, but why him? How did you get into him?
Well, you know, it's a roundabout way. It has something to do with my involvement with Esalen, the Esalen Center for Theory and Research in California, which is near where you are.
It's another thing we share in common. I've been involved in some courses offered through Esalen in the past, and I met the founders and so on.
Right. So you know Mike Murphy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I got involved there in 1998. Mike got together a group of people to study the issue of survival of death, whether we survive death, whether there's evidence for that, and what the meaning of that would be if there is evidence for it. And it came to be called the Survival Seminar, and we've produced books from there. And while I was working on that, Peirce came forward as a significant thinker in this whole area of the nature of human beings, but also the very evolution of the universe from nothing. He had a way of understanding that the universe could actually begin from nothing and become something. And that intrigued me. And when I looked more closely into what he was talking about, it led me to this little treatise of his called Evolutionary Love, where he talks a lot about precisely that. So it was through my involvement with that group at Esalen.
Fascinating, fascinating. And is that a continuing group? Is that going to continue to meet into the future?
That group ended in 2015. We met for about 15 years. And
wow.
It's over now, yes.
Yeah.
Two books that seem to kind of summarize what we wanted to do.
Can you capsulize what conclusions the group reached?
Sure. The first book is called Irreducible Mind, and it's for the 20th century psychology that goes beyond where psychology got in the 20th century. And it begins with the Society for Psychical Research, and particularly Frederick Myers, who is the great scholar of psychical research and important psychologist of the late 19th century. And what it's saying is that the phenomena that he and William James and others like him pointed out that have to be taken with some seriousness are things that are called paranormal phenomena, or the phenomena of psychical research, which had not, of course, been in good standing with conventional psychology at the time. And
Right.
so we went into that in great detail in the book Irreducible Mind, and all of the evidence for the various kinds of phenomena. And a lot of those phenomena are unusual phenomena of consciousness, such as multiple personality disorder and dissociations of various kinds. So that's what we did in that first book. We tried to lay down a really solid scientific and evidence-based case for paying attention to these phenomena. And in the second book, it's an attempt to find some way of formulating theories that could account for such phenomena that we were talking about in the first book. And the second book is more of a first attempt to do this. That is, there are different philosophies and spiritual understandings of the world that are talked about there. And we end up talking about an approach of having to do with evolution called Evolutionary Pantheism. And that seemed to be the one thing that united all of us. We have all of our various schools and ways of thinking, but that concept, which sees evolution as a kind of gradual realization of the divine in the evolved world, really struck a lot of us as a very useful approach.
Wow, fascinating. Again, all these touch points that we have in common. I actually taught an undergraduate course on parapsychology, and I was also a reviewer for a magazine called New Realities that is no longer around, and so we share a lot of interest. We may just wander off into other areas very easily.
Yes.
So your group actually started to investigate the idea, do we go on after this, right?
Yes.
And it sounds like, well, where did you end up in relation to that specific question?
Well, I would say in regard to that question, we didn't have one conclusion that we all agreed upon.
Okay.
I think many of us are tentative in saying that certainly something is happening, because there's a lot of evidence of remaining influences from people who've passed on, whether it's an information or apparent communications from them, whatever it may be, that there's something that should be paid attention to there. I think we'd all agree with that, but some of us, including myself, my position is it's not something you can prove. There isn't such a thing as evidence that you can gather that will be a solid and broadly accepted proof of survival of death, because there are alternate explanations, not just materialistic ones, but other alternate explanations that need to be considered as reasonable. Excuse me a second.
Sure.
So my position was, very likely there is some survival of death, but I have no idea what that looks like or how it operates.
Okay.
And I don't claim to believe that every instance where someone is supposed to be communicating from the dead is actually, that is actually happening.
Yeah, but I do get the sense that you believe in a non-materialist understanding of reality.
Yes,
that there's something beyond the material explanations that are generally offered up for surprising phenomena.
Yes, and that's why our second book is called Beyond Physicalism.
Mm-hmm.
Physicalism, as it turns out, is not an adequate explanation. It's one that actually falls down very badly philosophically and also in terms of contemporary physics. But that's a big story.
Yeah. Yeah. What other sorts of people were in that group, if I may ask?
There were psychiatrists, neurologists, Ed Kelly, who is from the University of Virginia, who does a lot of work with measuring brain waves and from the various approaches that you can take to that. He does research on hypnosis, not only hypnosis, but also meditation, that sort of thing. He has very important work and has a foundation that supports him out there. He was associated with, excuse me, with a man who did a lot of work on reincarnation from the University of Virginia in Stevenson.
I hear his name often, although I have yet to interview him. I guess I really must. I've not read his books or interviewed him.
Unfortunately, he passed away about 5 years ago.
Oh, that's why I haven't interviewed him.
Yeah.
Okay, at least not on this plane. That's too bad. I know other people who found his work to be credible and respected him.
Yes, yes. He wrote 8 books in the field. They're all research from field research. We had also psychologists, but also physicists in the group. By the end of our group, we had 2 quantum physicists involved, including Henry Stapp from the University of Berkeley. And so it was quite a broad spectrum of people, but a very compatible group, I would say.
Yeah. It sounds like a fascinating 15-year venture.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a bit more. You spoke in brief about Eros and agape as 2 different kinds of love, and which we know those concepts go back to the Greeks.
Yes.
And but there was some sense of marrying them to evolutionary theory. So maybe you can spell that out a bit more for us. Like, how do these relate to everything that we know about evolution? We know a lot more, I think, about evolution now than we did back when Darwin first began to write.
Yes. This only makes sense if you take evolution in its broadest sense, that is, that everything evolves.
Okay.
Don't consider evolution just from the point of view of biology, but from the point of view of the evolution of the whole universe, and more specifically, the evolution of intelligent beings, how that came about. If you look at it from that broadest point of view, then agape is the drive that's embedded in the universe to have everything within it evolve and move forward and develop the potentials that are there to the greatest extent that it's possible given the circumstances of each. That's the agape part of it. It's like a drive and a push to develop and realize potentials. And it affects all that exists in the universe. Eros is the love that seeks to grow, for the lover seeks to grow, become more, and in the Greek view is become more and more virtuous and more what we should be in terms of the spiritual life. And we do that through our encounters with the world, with other people, in our interactions with people. That's where Eros is involved. The orientation of Eros is that the lover is looking to get something from the loved one, because that loved one is admired or desired for various reasons. So Eros could also be called desire love, whereas agape is benevolent love that doesn't have any sense of wanting to do something for the lover. It's all for the sake of the loved one.
Okay. And there are places where in the book that it sort of in some ways rings to me of other cosmologies, including Buddhism. I can't say exactly how in any detail, but
that's in there, in that I have a sort of leaning towards Buddhism in certain aspects of the yogic philosophy also. So I have to say also that Peirce's philosophy, he called it objective idealism, and that means everything is mind. Everything is mind. And matter is just mind that has become so habitual that it doesn't change very much as it follows its path through evolution.
I have to tell you that there's a tagline that I use on this show at the end of every interview when the podcast goes up, which is, "It's all in your mind."
Yes, right. There you are. Peirce would agree with you.
Yeah, and I've also thought that I've got my own little thing I made up that if I can, that consciousness. So it's a way of really saying what you're saying. It's something that consciousness reaches a certain level of concentration, let's say, to where it begins to matter to itself.
Yes, yes. That's good. That's also very Peircean, because what he's saying is that if everything is mind, and for him that means it shows evidence of seeking to, it's goal-directed. That's what he means by mind. Whatever it is, it's a goal-directed something. Everything is that, but the degree of goal-directedness and the freedom to choose and move towards that goal is much greater in human beings than, let's say, in an iron molecule. And so that an iron molecule must be looked upon as a mind that is very habitual. It's developed these powerful habits that make it very difficult to do anything but what it's been doing.
Yeah.
Whereas human beings have a lot of latitude to be able to change what they've been doing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You also hearken back to William James.
Yes.
And tell him how he plays into what we've been talking about.
Well, one of the ways that I really like William James is that although he was a great philosopher, he pointed out why people don't like philosophy very much. And what he says is because a philosophy tends towards abstraction. We look at something and then we start making abstractions about it and talking about it in more general ways. And in the process, we lose the power of the concrete.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you go very far in that direction, it gets very boring and doesn't hold the attention very long. So I really thought that understanding about the importance of staying close to the reality, the concrete reality that surrounds us, is very important.
Yeah, and that's, I noticed you make some reference to phenomenology. That
Yes.
sounds relevant in terms of what you're just now saying, right?
Exactly. That's perfectly right, because phenomenology keeps us close to it. Phenomenology shows us the ways that we are projecting or conceptualizing and calling that reality. So calling those concepts reality when really they aren't. They're just a perspective on reality.
And I think of phenomenology as legitimizing, if you will, a conscious experience. In other words, that experience is very important, where other approaches to science will attempt to leave that out of the equation.
Yes, absolutely. That's right. I agree with that.
Uh-huh. And the phenomenological approach, of course, is really suited to the therapeutic situation, because you're dealing with a person's conscious experience and your conscious experience as the therapist, right?
That's right. In a therapeutic situation, this is so important what you're talking about here, because what I feel is really determines whether a person is an effective therapist and really able to help someone has to do if they can really accept that person for what they are, not how they fit into let's say, a framework of psychological understanding, but accept that person as an individual and realize that at any moment you can learn something new that you didn't find in the books that trained you. And so we need to be very phenomenologically oriented in regard to our clients, because
Yeah.
we have to let whatever's there come to us, not let them speak a bit and then impose our ideas and explain to them what's happening to them. I think that's a real mistake.
Yeah. You know, and at the same time, though, there is a moral imperative that runs through your book, a sense of should, that you're kind of exhorting the reader to, I'll let you fill in the blank. You're exhorting the reader to.
Exhorting the reader to, in terms of the two loves, to always keep agape, that is the love for the person that you love or the thing that you love, to grow and become what it can be, what it's meant to be, you might say. But that has to be primary. That's a should for me. That's the only should.
Okay. Yeah.
I agree. It's a book, in a way, it's a moral book about morals because it's talking about right action.
Yes.
I think that that is what agape is about. It's unconditional love. It's love without strings that desires the very best for whatever your love object is, whether that's a person, a pet, a plant, the environment. It's everything.
That's a place where it rings of Buddhism to me,
Yeah.
with the Buddhist idea of compassion and compassion for all sentient beings.
Yes, and non-sentient also for me because
Yeah.
it's that love, that push towards um, hoping that everything will develop is all through the cosmos. It's for everything. Everything is pushed by that
Yeah.
love.
Yeah. And also echoes of Jung in that for me, of uh, his idea that we all have some potential that that ideally gets realized if the circumstances are sufficiently nurturing, that
Yes,
we have a kind of unfolding, like a seed. There is a destiny that is contained within us
yes,
that hopefully gets released and revealed.
right. The individuation. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And also I'm thinking of Carl Rogers here
Oh, yes,
because of the unconditional love.
yes.
But, yeah, yeah.
Carl Rogers, a man quite a bit neglected these days, I would say. But he was a
Yeah, he's always been underappreciated, I think.
yeah, yeah,
And kind of, he's been reduced to a kind of caricature.
yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And so I guess one place where the moral part comes through is you have a section in the book on evolution and choice.
Yes.
Maybe you can take us through that a bit.
Yes, that's really a lot. There's a lot of Peirce in there. Peirce believed, you see, that there is a kind of what he would call pure chance of nature. That there are no natural laws of any absolute kind that have been imposed on nature from the outside. Nature acts and gradually forms its laws through forming habits of action.
Hmm.
And so he is saying that whether it is a non-living thing or living things, there's always an aspect of working towards a goal. The non-living thing has no consciousness of that goal, has no ability to reflect or know that it's moving towards a goal. But the more you move up through the forms of life and into human consciousness, the more awareness there is, and the more the person can be involved with a kind of freedom of choice, or the thing, like animals have some freedom of choice and so forth, up through human beings who have the greatest choice. Now, I kind of would you ask me the question again? I'm sort of losing track of what it was.
I can't exactly remember, other than to elaborate on your section on evolution and choice.
Choice, that's it, yes. So choice for Peirce and for me, and if anyone who holds that reality is basically mind, choice is something that operates everywhere and all through the cosmos, but it operates most powerfully through human beings.
Yeah. I'm wondering about the quantum physicists in your group. Did they have a way of speaking about this that you
Oh, yes.
recall?
Henry Stapp, yes, he has written some things about the place of mind in quantum physics. Very, very interesting stuff. Choosing is a really important part of quantum physics because the observer makes a choice and that affects the outcome. So the notion of choice being involved in life and in the world is actually fundamental to quantum physics.
Mm-hmm. Well, um, and you actually had a section on the human potential movement,
Yes.
which is that's an I'm very identified with that. I was a professor at Sonoma State University, which was the first one in the country to offer actually a master's degree in humanistic psychology,
Oh,
and so and was definitely participating in the human potential movement all along.
Oh, that's
So
terrific. Yet the human potential movement is so akin to the ideas that I'm developing in this book, because you see, it's talking about love as pushing for development of potentials.
yeah,
That's what
yeah.
it's about. And in another book that I wrote called Memoir of a Trance Therapist, I talk about the fact that I believe that in human potential movements, the endeavor to grow and become what you can be is always accompanied by trance states. That is, you develop trance states within which you find that the growth and the evocation of those potentials can occur. So if you think about sorts of things that have been going on in Esalen, most of those include some kind of trance states, as I understand trances.
Yeah, well, say more about how you understand trances, because uh, you're not talking here about somebody who looks like a zombie.
That's right.
You're using it in a much broader general sense.
Yes. I developed this in a book called Trance Zero that I wrote in 1997, where I have, you see, I've been a historian of hypnosis, animal magnetism and hypnosis, the history of that from Mesmer up to Freud. I have a book called From Mesmer to Freud. And where I trace that, it's very clear that, wait a minute, where was I? Would you repeat the question again?
We were talking about trance and your view of trance.
Trance, yes. It was very clear that trances are, or hypnosis as it had come to be understood after Mesmer and his followers, that's a later term, was never well defined. It wasn't defined in such a way that you could get complete agreement with everybody who uses it or experiments with it. So I was struggling in 1997 to come up with a definition that would include the whole variety of things that seemed to have a hypnotic dimension to them. And what I came up with was that trance is a state of focus on something, diminished awareness of everything else, which then evokes subliminal responses from the depth of the person who's doing the focusing.
Oh, I want to explore this some more. So would you say that trance is operating anytime someone is passionately engaged with
Yes,
something?
I would say it is. I would say it's operating in you and me right now. Right now we're focused on our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You're not as aware of the room that I might be, because I'm looking at it, but right now you're probably not all that aware of what the room around you is like and so forth. You're really involved, and me here too.
Right.
That focus cuts down awareness of everything else. That's the second element, the diminished awareness of everything else. And when you're doing that, then this provides an opening for the unconscious to bring forward whatever's needed to do the job that you're focusing on, or to do the thing that you're focusing on, or to engage with the person that you're focusing on. That comes then from the unconscious. So it's focusing, diminished awareness of everything else, and then we find automatically we produce what we need to do what is the task before us. So
That's yeah.
right
Yeah,
now,
you trigger so many ideas in my head. Go ahead, finish
right,
your
right
thought.
now, you see, as we're talking, there are all kinds of things coming for you, coming forward,
Yeah.
all kinds of things coming from
Uh,
me coming forward, and that's what happens when you go into a trance.
well, the thing that just got triggered just now is like when you're writing a book, say,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly all sorts of resources are becoming available to you,
Exactly.
not just internally, but also seemingly, people say, give it over to the universe.
Yes.
Seemingly from the universe, people are coming up and saying, oh, have you read such and such? Or, kind of giving you resources that help your project, whether it be writing a book or some other sort of project.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. So yes,
Yeah.
the way I put it, it sounds like it's coming just from the individual, but in fact, the individual is embedded in the human community.
Yeah.
Connections that are active all the time in that being embedded, and so those are evoked too.
Yeah. You use the term subliminal resources. And so I guess that term's getting at this phenomenon that there are resources that are being drawn to us, or that we don't consciously recognize as ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the word subliminal is I choose to use from Frederick Myers, who talked about the subliminal self. He developed the notion of the unconscious, but he preferred the term subliminal self, which means below the threshold of consciousness.
Okay. And as a historian of hypnosis, I wanted to talk to you about something else. It has seemed to me that there is a high, in terms of the history of hypnosis, there's kind of a high road and a low road, and the high road being the scientifically acknowledged kind of official history. And then there's a sort of more unofficial history, I think, that some popular books and other books that maybe would not be regarded as, as totally mainstream with a good housekeeping seal of approval, that have interesting stories to relate. For example, I have read, and I wonder if you come across this, accounts of people who were around in the early days of animal magnetism and what came to be called hypnosis, who look back on that time, some time has gone by, a lot of time, and they say, there was stuff going on back then that doesn't seem to be happening anymore.
Yes. That's
right. And I think that's fascinating. It's as if we were, passing through some kind of age of Aquarius or something like that, that there was some kind of archetypal field that we were all passing through that enabled certain kinds of experiences that later were not so available to us. Does this make any kind of sense?
It does make sense, and I would see it at least partially as involved social forces being involved in creating or repressing. It's interesting that in the 1890s, there were a couple of books that tried to draw, I think fruitfully, a distinction between animal magnetism, which was the early form of hypnosis, and hypnosis after Braid, James Braid. James Braid is the one who used the name hypnosis in the 1840s. Animal magnetism started in the 1780s, so there was a whole 50 years there. Now, Braid's approach really did a lot to squelch the kind of thing you're talking about, because Braid said, we can't accept, I believe that all the phenomena we see around animal magnetism are true, but they're not due to an influence or a kind of energy going back and forth between the person who's magnetizing and the person being magnetized. Rather, you're creating a psychological state in the person being magnetized, and that accounts to the phenomena that occur. In other words, it's a purely psychological state, and it's purely psychologically through suggestion. That's Braid. Now, this made a lot of people happy because you get rid of the woo-woo stuff of an energy that might be passing or be involved.
Right.
In addition to just exchanging of information, let's say. So it became like the orthodox approach to hypnosis. Then in the 1890s, about 100 years after Mesmer and Puiseux, who had a very important role in all that we have today of that work, some people wrote about books trying to distinguish between the animal magnetism, the magical stuff going on with animal magnetism, and the more pedestrian stuff going on with hypnosis. And they're very interesting, those books.
Yeah.
One of them, it was written by J. Thompson Hudson. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
No.
He wrote a book. He tells this story in the book that's really interesting. He said, see, he believed there's a lot more in animal magnetism than in hypnosis. That's why hypnosis couldn't produce a lot of stuff. But what he said, there's this person who goes up, he's called a person who has magical ways with horses. Today we would call him a horse whisperer.
Yeah, yeah.
He says this guy goes up to the horse and he looks the horse in the eye, and this is what they believe happens. He looks the horse in the eye and he throws the horse into a trance state, and therefore he becomes docile and he can do what he wants with him. He said that's not what's happening to him. What's happening is that he goes up to the horse, he looks the horse into the eye, and he becomes hypnotized. And therefore, he's in communication with the horse on a whole other level. And so he can do what he wants to do with the horse and help the horse, you know, train the horse and so forth.
Yeah, that's a novel idea that I haven't heard before. So in other words, they kind of become on a channel together.
Exactly. That's what he's
Yeah.
saying. It's
Yeah.
not that the man gains control of the horse.
Yeah.
This communication gets control of the man.
Yeah, one of the things that has always amazed me is the accounts of the Scottish surgeon James Esdale,
Yes.
who was working in India, and I believe he was of maybe the tail end of the animal magnetism school, and he would he would train people who were working under him to move their hands over the body of the person who was about to undergo surgery. And the accounts describe these sort of what we would call agonizing, potentially agonizingly painful, frightening, terribly frightening kinds of surgery. And the patients would feel nothing. They wouldn't protest. They could allow the surgeon to reach in and move things about and so on.
That's true.
Incredible stories that this doesn't happen today.
It was also Elliotson who did the same thing with surgery. You know, and right when they were doing this sort of thing, and one of the great things about that approach to surgery is you can keep them painless afterwards without medication.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was just the time when chemical anesthetics were being discovered.
Right.
Took over everything. And
yes.
the development of that side of things was put aside. Really
yeah.
very far.
Yeah, because the chemical seemed so efficient and kind of tended to work on everybody and so on.
That's right.
Yeah, well, we've wandered a bit. Well, actually, in your book, you talk about the 4 trance states. So since we're talking about trances, what are the 4 trance states?
Yes. The definition of trance as focus and diminished awareness and the evocation of resources. When I was writing Trance Zero, I thought, well, you know, I'd like to make this a little more concrete, maybe something that's more easily illustrated. Maybe I could talk about different ways in which that can occur. So I sort of arbitrarily chose 3. That is trances that are situational trances, where what we're focused on is some task, some action, or something like that. We're focused on that, and we have diminished awareness of everything else.
That might be what Csikszentmihalyi calls flow, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Huh?
And so we have all this, these resources come forward from us for the task. That's one kind. Interpersonal trance, another kind of trance, where what we're focused on is another person and all that that person means to us and the communication that takes place between us. And what we have diminished awarenesses of everything else. And I'm sure you've had the experience of being like at a restaurant where 2 people, a couple, let's say, become very engaged with each other, maybe in anger, maybe in excitement, but they're not aware of anything going on around them. That awareness is cut way, way down, and they're totally involved with each other, and there are all kinds of things called forth from each to the other in that interpersonal trance. So that's the second kind of trance, interpersonal. And the third kind of trance is an inner mind trance. And here is where hypnosis comes. Hypnosis is just one kind of trance for me. My definition of hypnosis is an inner mind trance with rapport with whoever's doing the entrancing. And inner mind trance is where the focus is on our inner mind and all of the images that are coming and come and go there, and all the things that may move into that inner theater of the mind. And what we have diminished awareness is of everything around us, our physical environment, that sort of thing. much less awareness of that. And then we deal with what's in the inner mind. And that's what I do all the time in my psychotherapy work. I use a lot of inner mind trances, or I call it therapeutic trance, with my clients, so that they can go in and explore what's going on in them about a certain area that they are looking at the particular time. That's an inner mind trance. Meditation is an inner mind trance, but since there's no rapport involved with a magnetizer or a hypnotizer, it's not, I don't call it hypnosis. Hypnosis needs that other element of connection or rapport with the person who's inducing the trance. And the fourth trance is group mind trance. And this is the one that surprised most people. And that is where a person, what they're focused on is the feeling and the ideas of a particular group that at that moment they're involved with. And what they have diminished awareness is of all other feelings and thoughts that they may have normally in their life. Examples of powerful inner group mind trances are lynch mobs, soccer games,
unfortunately,
church groups. Like, it isn't always negative. Church groups, for instance, can form have this group mind trance. It's very wonderful. So it's a focus where the group feeling becomes.
What about political parties?
Political parties, absolutely. Staff at work. That can be a group mind trance where there's this way of thinking about all the people there and what's going on that forms a sort of consistency in the whole group and takes a life of its own. So that's a group mind trance. Mm-hmm. For me, the group mind trance of a whole culture is a cultural trance. And the whole culture has its own ways of seeing things and responding to things.
Yeah. You know what? I'm realizing that time is running along here, and we're having a good time on the love part of the book. We haven't gotten into the other part of the title is rapacious greed. So that's a very powerful statement. Tell us about rapacious greed and its role in this.
Well, it's actually the Ravages of Greed is what I say. But
I'm sorry, you did. Okay, I'm going to have to see my analyst. Where's that rapacious coming from? Ravages of Greed, yes. I suppose I could edit that out, but I won't.
Well, you know, I was struck by one of the things that Peirce wrote about in this little treatise called Evolutionary Love was the philosophy of greed. And I couldn't figure out, he doesn't connect it very organically with what he's talking about, but it really is very much connected with evolutionary love. Because for me, remember I talked about the primacy of agape over eros and
yes,
and so forth.
That's where the should is, that we must nurture the agape part of ourselves.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we should never let that be overcome by the enriching, where the person is looking for enrichment, whether that's money, power, being loved, feeling good, whatever it may be. Those might be all good things. But if they push out our agapic awareness of the importance of the person's development, the loved person's development, then that's a moral violation as far as I'm concerned, in that agape must always be primary. We cannot use people to enrich ourselves. We cannot work to their detriment in order to become more. That's the principle of primacy of agape. Mm-hmm. And where agape is pushed out and where greed takes over, and particularly the kind of devouring part of greed, of eros, which I mentioned in one part of the book, I call agape the conscience of eros. Mm-hmm. As long as eros is operating under the conscience of agape, it's fine. It's balanced. But if that conscience is pushed out, then terrible things happen. And that's why I believe, I said this, that I believe that all the great human failures and injustices and atrocities over the ages have been due to greed, in my opinion. And all of the great accomplishments and creativities that have happened to the human race have been due to agape.
Okay. You know, the world seems to be in such dreadful condition right now in many ways. And I don't know if that's because we read the newspapers and it brings it more into our awareness, but who's winning right now? You know, it almost seems like the greed might be winning on a fairly large scale.
It does seem that way. And one of the things is that when greed is in the ascendancy, the notion of truth suffers, because truth is not a value in face of the desire to devour and to have more and more. One of the ways of describing greed is the feeling that you must have more and more and more of whatever it may be. So truth then becomes a very secondary value, but that's another thing that I won't go into at the moment. But I agree with you. I think that now what we're seeing, like we've never seen before, well, we haven't seen for a long time, is the nakedness of greed in our society. It just shows itself without compunction. You know, it used to be that greedy people had to put on a good show of benevolence.
Yeah, right.
No longer. And you know, in the 1980s, CNN had a series on the 80s, and one of the qualities that they were looking at there was greed, and they called it the decade of greed. And the movie Wall Street, with Gecko's pronouncement, "Greed is good."
Yeah, Gordon Gekko. Yeah.
That's coming out into the open, no longer disguised, just saying for its own sake, it's good. And that's what I consider to be the antithesis of moral action, because greed in its own sake has no conscience.
So what sustains you during this period, if I may ask a personal question?
Well, what sustains me is I've lived long enough to know that things pass. And however it will be, those who are greedy and who are looking to get as much as they can for themselves, no matter how they describe it, those who are doing that will eventually pass. And the human spirit will remain, regardless of what sufferings it may have been incurred through this action of greed. One of the things that I have in the very final chapter of my book is that the overcoming of greed in the world has to be a grassroots thing. It has to be changes in people as individuals and as groups of people, that they actually change and see the importance of agape and feel agape and actually live their lives under the kind of conscience of agape. If that can be done on the grassroots level, then it'll change everything. You can't change it from the top down.
That's a wonderful wrap up, I think, for our discussion here. A good note to leave people with and to ponder on. So, Dr. Adam Crabtree, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
You're welcome. I very much enjoyed it.